You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Sunday, May 18th of the year 2025. Got some stuff to talk about on the national scene as we take a look at some things going on in college football. And we'll have more podcasts coming up here throughout the week as we got a lot going on in and around Indiana adjacent items. We've got Pacers Knicks, that about to start up in the Eastern Conference Finals. So Scott and I are going to have a podcast soon to talk about that. Got the Indy 500 coming up. As we sit right now, we're about halfway through the qualification process. They've got to do Fast 12 today and the bumping process, and then we'll know what the field looks like. We'll have a preview of that as well. We got a lot going on with IU football, especially on the recruiting front. We got to recap the portal. So hopefully we'll have Taylor Lehman back sometime this week, and we'll chat about that. And then just lots of other things going on. So it's a good time, even though it's kind of a lull in the actual like on court or on field activity period. No practices or anything going on right now, but a lot to talk about nonetheless. And so we're going to work through some solo items today. Scott might join us later on in the show, or he might not. But we'll have Scott on the next podcast, regardless of whether he's on later on in this one. So anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go with the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. And of course, they've got their new Indy 500 apparel lineup out. Some really, really good looking stuff there. They've got some new college related items out. You can catch up on all of these by following them on social or signing up for their newsletter, as you'll get notifications about what's going on with all of your favorite Home Field Apparel items. Some great stuff across the board, not just college. I was up at Gainbridge Fieldhouse yesterday for the opening day of the Indiana Fevers season, and a ton of Home Field Apparel in the gift shop there, or the team shop, I guess, at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. It was great to see all that awesome Home Field Fever apparel. And I know they've got a brand new shirt that kind of sits halfway between Indy 500 and Pacers season. You want to go check that out as well. Use the code HOME23 and you'll get 15% off your first order. It's great seeing Home Field in all of these stores. I got to say, I was down at the University of Miami last week. I had to go down for a retirement party for a friend, and it was fascinating going through the Miami team shop. I've been in that team shop 100 times. I used to teach at the U, and it's I'm going through, and you got your Adidas area, you got your Champion area, you got your Fanatics area, and there's Home Field, and like the Home Field Miami pullover and a couple of other really cool items. So it's just good to see Home Field out in the wild. And of course I see them on people's bodies all the time, all over the place, at football games, at basketball games, everywhere. So join the Home Field group, become part of the collection. Basically, they got new stuff coming out all the time. Again, homefieldapparel.com. Also, just a reminder, we are on YouTube, and many people think it's the best way to consume Back Home Network stuff. We've got, of course, not just Crimson Cast. We've got the Assembly Call. We've got the Doing the Work podcast. We've got the Dribble Drive, Austin Render, taking a look at the women's basketball game across the country. We've got X's and Joe's. I mean, it's just a real big collection of podcasts. We've got commentaries. We've got other items coming up and some special surprises, hopefully, for you over the course of the summer and into football season. So go over, search Back Home Network on YouTube, and just go ahead and subscribe. And we'd love to have you join that. Over 7,600 people have subscribed to the YouTube channel. We've also got Spotify. We've got Apple Podcasts. You can get Back Home Network anywhere, but we do a lot of video stuff now, graphics and stories and things like that. So anything we can do to get you on board, we'd love to have you in the mix. You get notifications whenever our podcasts go live or whenever we upload something. Also, we're on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. It's free to sign up. It's also an opportunity, if you want to financially support the podcast, $5 a month, $50 a year. We really appreciate all the support. The over 120 people that are paying subscribers to Crimson Cast. You don't have to do it, but you do it, and we love you for it. Thank you so much. Before we get started, kind of a somber note, wanted to express our thoughts and condolences to all the folks affected by the storms that blew through not just Bloomington, but southern Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, northwest or northeast Arkansas, I guess, a little bit in Tennessee, of course, on Friday of this week. It was a pretty rough day, and there were a lot of reports of pretty big storms. There was a huge tornado that set down near Linton, Indiana, over in Greene County, which of course is very close to Bloomington and Monroe County. That tornado in various forms moved its way across southern Bloomington and damaged, I think, 75 homes. There were 4 injuries. The post office on Rogers Street on the south side near Clear Creek was destroyed. It was a really scary situation. And I live kind of south of the mall in the Bloomington area. And when the tornado warning sirens went off, I got, everybody was put in a safe spot, and I was keeping an eye on the skies going to the south and was looking that direction, and I was being safe. I promise, folks. I was going to get to a safe spot if I needed to, but I'm looking up in the sky, and the sun comes out. It was a very weird view because there's thunder, there's lightning over on the right side, kind of towards town, and then there's this opening of clouds and sun. But I'm looking up in the air, and I see these shiny specks rotating around in the atmosphere, and I realize it's debris. And there's a small funnel that's not completely connected to the ground. So fortunately, that thing didn't touch down near where I was at, but only a couple of miles away. I certainly left a path of devastation. And so our thoughts with everybody here, and of course, multiple fatalities in the state of Kentucky, our thoughts and just kind of good vibes going out to the people that are down in that area, as it was a really rough set of storms. And hopefully, it's one of those things where everybody just realizes got to keep an eye on the weather. We try to put some weather alerts and notifications up on the Crimson Cast Twitter feed when we can, just to do whatever part we can to help notify people that there's bad stuff coming. But really remarkable seeing some of the videos coming out of southern Monroe County. We haven't had a tornado get that close in a while. And of course, then there was another storm that went across the northern part of the state, touching down over near Farmersburg, coming across through Spencer, and then just north of Ellettsville. A couple of houses damaged or destroyed up there as well. So just really hope that everybody affected by those storms can get their lives back together soon and get the help that they need. And our thoughts with all of those folks. And it's certainly been a powerful weather season so far here in southern Indiana. So hopefully everybody's staying safe. We wanted to go ahead and talk about a couple of items on the national scene in terms of football. And it's interesting because this is generally historically the time of year where IU fans tune out of what's going on the national football scene, because it's rarely felt like Indiana is really part of it. And that's not the case anymore. Between the 11-1 regular season last year and the college football playoff appearance, and how well Indiana did in the portal, how much Indiana's done to combat, poaching of their coaching staff. They basically kept everybody but one person, despite multiple people on the coaching staff being targets of top teams in the Power 4 or the Power 2. Indiana really feels like it's trying to build and be here to stay. I don't know if anybody saw that article that Pete Thamel wrote on May 15th. I guess that would have been, Thursday, about Curt Cignetti and IU football. But it was really interesting hearing some of the quotes in that. Scott Dolson, after there's this whole laundry list of things that Indiana did from a money perspective, creating an $11 million staff salary pool, giving, of course, Curt Cignetti a $72 million deal. But there's this quote from Scott Dolson that said, quote, "Last year was an incredible start. We are paranoid. We don't want to be a one-hit wonder." And as Scott joins me here, Scott, I was just quoting from that article that, first of all, good morning, Scott. Great to see you. How you doing today? Scott doesn't have audio yet, so we've sprung a surprise on him here, obviously. But great to see those types of quotes from Scott Dolson, not the kind of thing that we're used to seeing from athletic directors at Indiana University. This idea that, we've got to go out, we've got to spend money, we've got to spend money at a high level. There's a quote at the end of the article from Dolson. We want to strategically invest. We felt all the things we've done since we brought Coach Sig here have been strategic, not off the cuff. And Scott, do we have you now? Is your audio working?
You do, yes.
Hey, all right. I was talking about that Pete Thamel article about Curt Cignetti from a couple of days ago to start this kind of thing about how this is not a time normally when IU fans are paying attention to what's going on in college football nationwide, but we have to at this point because Indiana appears to be bound and determined to keep themselves in the upper echelons of college football, which let's just stop at the beginning and say, wow, that's awesome. I like hearing that.
Well, it's something we've talked about that, when Cignetti talks about the support he's getting, it's always not in the present tense or in the past tense. It's always present and future, which is the support we're getting has been awesome and it needs to continue to be awesome. And so, I could see a world where we double our NIL money, we win the national championship, and Cignetti's going to be like, that was great. We got to keep doing this. We need to do even more. I mean, like he's always pushing the screws. And I think that's good. And that's unlike any coach we've ever had.
I think it's turning the screws.
Yeah. I mean, that's unlike any coach we've ever had.
I know.
And Mallory I was alive for that. I don't remember his reaction toward the administration, but there was a feeling with Tom Allen where we kind of had that great season. It was like, hey, we did it, guys. Like we've now achieved, singularity with college football. And it wasn't this feeling of like, we need to continue to do more. It definitely felt like we've arrived.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've really enjoyed with City because that has to happen. I mean, that has to happen. I think he understands too. This program is one that needs to continually be pushed.
No, you bring up a couple of really good examples. I think going back and looking at the Mallory era, looking at the articles, looking at the way that things happened, there was this sense like, hey, we won with our resources. Great. And then it gradually tailed off. And even though Mallory was a great coach and had a great staff, the investment wasn't there. There's that famous story of Mallory having to go out and personally fundraise for what became Mellencamp Pavilion, despite the president of the university saying, I don't understand why we need this. Like that was the level of like disassociation. And, with Tom Allen, it almost felt like IU won in those 2 years and no one really totally understood like how or why it happened other than, hey, this is great. Allen himself among those. And you can see that with the staff hires. It's funny. I was going through my phone yesterday, deleting old messages, and I had snapped a picture of the article where they made Rod Carey the highest paid assistant in Indiana history. As this was a guy they brought in as offensive coordinator when they had to fire Walt Bell. And it's like, it really felt like there was just a lot of grasping at straws, whereas with Cignetti, it does feel systematic.
Well, and don't forget the time Wilson came in, which is like, y'all suck. This is college football, but that only lasted from he kind of stopped pushing the ball a little bit too. But
so the paradigm shift's been pretty remarkable. The reason I wanted to bring all this up though, where there were some stories in college football nationally that Indiana is a part of now. And I think this is one of those things that's hard for people to get their heads wrapped around, is this idea that when you see a story about college football playoff seeding or who gets into the college football playoff, it's like, hey, that's us now. Right. To quote Ron Silver at the Clinton inauguration, those are our planes now. It's one of those deals where you've got to have a mentality shift. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of these because the machinations and the kind of inner workings of college football from a political perspective are oftentimes just as entertaining as what goes on the field, if you like that kind of thing. And so,
well, before you dive into it, I've seen this on Instagram. It'll be like, college program success over the last 20 years. And there'll be the college basketball one of like, championships, Final Fours, Sweet 16s. Like, oh, hey, I see IU in the little sliver of teams that have won a game. And then they'll do the same thing for college football. And it's like, oh, like we're up there with the teams that made the college football playoff. It's wild. Like
because we made the college football playoff.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
It's important to mention that like at every single juncture, I think.
And I mean, this is always, we made it and played one of the better games. But like just everyone's like, oh, like they got their butt kicked. Like, no, like Tennessee got their butts whooped. Like we actually played a pretty good game against, I heard one of your other pods talking about, Ohio State won the national championship last time. Like the only two teams he lost to were the national championship. Like just again, let's all remember that. Go ahead.
And honestly, what we were going to talk about actually ties into that very model because, Indiana made the college football playoff last year, as we all know, but kind of got screwed a little bit by the rule that apparently we are close to consensus now on changing, or apparently, if I wanted to pronounce it like a regular human being. So there was a story from CBS Sports. This was Brandon Marcello on Wednesday of this week, noting that, and I'm going to quote here, the college football playoffs power brokers are nearing consensus to change the seeding process next season and eliminate first-round buys for conference champions. And this is important because, I think to some degree we've had to kind of dump our brains a little bit as far as what all happened in the college football playoff, not so much the Indiana game, but like how everything's set up. And, I want to remind everybody, I want to call up a graphic here just so we can all get on the same page. But if you go back and remember what the playoff bracket looked like, I think it's important to remember that because of the way that the seeding was set up, where the top 4 conference champions were guaranteed buys, regardless of where they were within the structure of things, it meant you ended up with Oregon as the number 1 seed. You ended up with Georgia as the number 2. You ended up with Boise State as the number 3, and then you ended up with Arizona State as the number 4. And that ended up pushing a bunch of teams down, So if you go and look at, I'm going to call up a different screen here but I think, it's important that we get all this together. If you go back and look at the way that the rankings were going in, Oregon, the top 4 should have been Oregon, then Georgia, then Texas, then Penn State. Those should have been the top 4 seeds. Notre Dame was 5, Ohio State was 6, Tennessee was 7, Indiana was 8. Now, in a world where you're seeding based upon ranking, what you would have had there would have been those top 4 teams getting the buys. And then the first round games would have been Notre Dame versus Arizona State, Ohio State hosting Alabama, Tennessee hosting SMU, and then Indiana hosting Boise State. Instead, you ended up with a situation, obviously, where not only was that not the setup, but you also lose Alabama out of that mix because you put Clemson in as that 5th, conference champion. Now that wouldn't change, but what would have changed would have been the seeding. Big difference for a team like Indiana, who by all accounts, by the way the poll was set up, was 8th in the country. Instead of having to go to Notre Dame and play them, to be able to host Boise State, that would have been the setup in this. That would have made a huge difference, I think, just in terms of Indiana and how they would have fared. You would have had the home crowd. You would have played Boise State. You would have, I think, from there gone on and played Oregon in the Rose Bowl, which, given how Oregon played in the Rose Bowl, might not have been a completely unwinnable game if you get kind of your sea legs under you. So this is where
the game been Indiana Boise State. I'm sure they would have found a way to put that on streaming somewhere. It's like,
yeah,
hey, can we do a game at midnight on Saturday night?
Hey, Peacock, here's what we can do for you. Yes,
Peacock Premium, like the next level of Peacock you have to pay for.
Peacock.
But also, the other thing that it did, I think it actually, Oregon really had a real claim to be pissed at the way the bracket broke. But what it did as you released those shows, the top 12 shows, it reminded me very much of sometimes when you watch the NBA the NBA draft. The NBA has this thing where every team has to make a pick, even if they traded it. So it becomes this the Toronto Raptors are picking, but it actually traded to the Mavericks. So this person's not it's very confusing. Just give him a Mavericks hat. Why are you giving him a Raptors hat? And they would have these moments where it's all right, the 12th seed is Clemson, but they're at, and 11th is Arizona State, but they're actually going to be 4. They're not 11. It's well, why are you doing and then it also kind of got rid of some of the suspense because basically you knew there was already 5 teams who were there. You knew it's you basically were looking at who are the once you saw Alabama wasn't in, it's all right, the rest of the show, there's no point. It ruined the drama of the show and also made it way more confusing when it's here's the bottom 4 teams. But when I show you the bracket, now Boise State's got to buy.
Yeah. It's also informative if you go back and think about it. The 4 teams that got buys all lost in that game. Boise State, they get blown out by Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. Arizona State was a good game in the Peach Bowl, but Texas they were the superior team because, of course, they were. Ohio State blows out Oregon. Notre Dame handles Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. And, when you get right down to it, like this, to me, there's two separate issues. Like, one, it really did feel like the committee, this is going to be controversial, but it actually feeds into the second story that I wanted to touch on. The committee still does not know how to handle losses in college football. They don't know how to handle conference championship games. And to some degree, those things almost like that being your primary metric, the longstanding thing like, well, this team didn't lose, so therefore they must be the best team in the country, doesn't really work in a world where you have unbalanced conference schedules and where you have teams that can waltz through relatively easy conferences, win a bunch of games. You look at Ohio State. They finished 6th in the poll. Because of the auto bidding, they ended up the 8th seed. That's the problem with that ultimately is like you shouldn't have and this was brought up multiple times, like you shouldn't have a team that's that good ranked 6th. That team was, I think, clearly better than 6th. But the committee doesn't know how to process those things yet very effectively because they're worried about the perception of, well, how can we have a 2-loss team above a 1-loss team? But then they had a bunch of 2-loss teams above 1-loss teams. Like the whole thing almost needs a reset in terms of how you're metricizing it on the committee level. But at the very least, what you could do is say, hey, you know what? It might not be a great idea to give a bye to the 12th ranked team in the poll, which in this case was Arizona State, or the 9th ranked team in Boise State, because conference champions don't necessarily mean what they used to mean. It's still an accomplishment, but when you only play 70% of your conference, and when it might not even be the best 70% of your conference, and when you may play somebody in your conference championship game that isn't that great, it's hard to really take it that seriously when you talk about actually who are the best teams. So,
well, and again, I know you know this, but this was partially this way because this really wasn't a plan to set out to have the best way to find the champion. It was a way that people with differing opinions could create a system where everyone was somewhat happy. Because if you're, if you're the Big 12, it's like, well, we want our conference champion to get a bye. Like the Big 10 and SEC get it. Like, and it became a status symbol of like, oh, well, our conference got a bye and yours didn't. So we're one of the Big 4 conferences. And this is unfortunately the politics of college football and college athletics bleeds into this because, I'm sure the Big 12 is like, I'll be damned if we're not going to be one of the buys, because if it's just the SEC and the Big 10 that get the buys, and it's like those are the Big 3, the Big 2.
Ironically, though, I do think that they have said that because that's part of the CBS story is that now the ACC and the Big 12 are supporting the straight seeding proposal. And I have some theories as to why. I think a lot of it for them, like the Big 10 and the SEC have been
no buys. I mean, like then it's like,
well, okay, that can't happen this upcoming year. Right. Because it's still 12 teams. So you're going to have buys. Like there's no way around it.
Right.
But the fact
for 16,
the ACC and the Big 12 supporting straight no buy or no conference champions buys is an important step. I think they're looking at it and saying, well, if the committee's going to vote on things the way that they did this past year, if we can get a team through or 2 teams through that only have 1 loss, we're going to be up in that top 4 echelon regardless. And it was very unusual that Boise State would have been that high in the CFP poll. That probably won't happen again. So we'll probably be in good shape anyway. It's going to be interesting though, because if you're still guaranteeing conference champions, they're going to have to be in there somewhere. Where you are going to see, I think, things be really curious and where the politics really do play in is in the second story. And this was won by Ross Dellinger at Yahoo. So he's down in Amelia Island as the spring meetings are beginning for the ACC, but basically trying to take the temperature on what's going to happen when they do expand to 16 teams, because the Big 10 and the SEC have been pretty consistently advocating for 4 automatic bids per conference, which would be right now 8 of the 12 teams in the playoff. If you expand to 16, which again will almost certainly happen, that's half the field would be Big 10 and the SEC teams. What happens after that? Well, there's been pushback from that, there was initially this idea of what you would call a 4-4-2-2-1, 4 from each of the two top conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, 2 each from the Big 12 and the ACC, and then Notre Dame. Well, in a 16-team format, that only leaves you with 3 at-larges that would come from outside that mix. And it would only leave you with 1 at-large in a 12-team field. So there's been some pushback. Actually, sorry, you couldn't do it in a 12-team field because you'd have 13 teams at that point. So what you deal with now is this situation where there's these arguments about auto bids for conferences as a whole. And a lot of people, Scott, have pushed back on this idea because they're like, well, it should be meritocratic. Like, we should just take the top 16 teams regardless. But, there's some arguments to the contrary. And I think to some degree, IU fans, if you're trying to figure out what should I feel about this, one of the things that this is being used as, this idea of these 4 auto bids, is to try to get the SEC to do what everybody else, except the ACC, I guess now, has said they're going to do, which is move to 9 conference games, and also to set up some kind of a cross-conference scheduling agreement where you'd have one locked-in game where a Big Ten team and SEC team were going to play each other. I can see why the SEC would be hesitant about a 9th game, because as we saw last year, the SEC kind of ate itself up.
Right.
And there wasn't really a dominant team. And honestly, this year, it doesn't look like there's going to necessarily be a dominant SEC team. Maybe, but Georgia lost a ton. It's uncertain what you're going to see with some of the other teams in that conference. And when you look at the ACC, they've got Clemson, who's a lot of people are rating them number 1. You've got a couple of other teams across the country that might be contenders for this. The Big Ten and the SEC are saying, look, we're locking ourselves into tougher schedules. We clearly have a much greater clustering of high revenue generating teams, and that's going to continue to be exacerbated. There needs to be some kind of protection there. And when you add in the idea that you're not playing balanced schedules in these conferences, it does kind of raise the question, like, you can say it's meritocratic because X team or Y team in the Big 12 or the ACC only lost a game. The flip side is they're playing a weaker set of competitors, and they're putting themselves in a position where it's easier to go through with 1 loss. Why should that be rewarded? There's a lot of things at play here.
Well, it comes down into the details of, and this is changing almost every year. Same thing in basketball. You could say we're going to take the top 16 teams, but what is that 16 based on? Is it based on the coaches poll, the AP poll, a computer poll, strength of schedule? Because all of those things are weighted either positively or negatively against an SEC or a Big Ten or an ACC or a Mountain West. And teams are going to find ways to kind of game the system. If it's And if you do, like, we're going to do a mix of them, it's like, all right, what's the mix? Like, is it 25% of each? Is it, 18% of each? Because depending on the mix, depends on how you're going to do it. So I fully, your view of how you think it's going to be is one thing. Like, I fully understand just the politics of, you're the Big Ten and SEC. You come in, it's like, look, guys, this is our tournament. Like, we're bringing the money, we're bringing the teams, we're bringing the TV. We're not about to have 5 Mountain West schools in this tournament. Like, so we're going to guarantee us our teams in here, and we're going to do it because it's real easy to just say, oh, take the top 16. But how you figure what those 16 are is a real debate, and there isn't a real clear answer. You can't just say, oh, well, it's the 16 based on this computer metric, because as we've seen, like, it's like, where does strength of schedule fit in? If you strength of schedule, then, a Mountain West team is going to have a way different, number than a Big Ten team.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think the way that we have processed football in general, even at the professional level, is changing a little bit. So I saw a story the other day about how the NFL is strongly considering going away from their current model, which guarantees a first-round home game to the 4 divisional champions in each conference, and moving towards a system where your record is the sole element of seeding. So you could have a wild card team. If I've got a team that finishes 14-3 in the conference or a division, another team that finishes 12-5, but the 12-5 is ahead of, like, whoever wins the AFC South, who's probably 8-9. Why should the 8-9 team get a first round bye or a first round home game just because? And I think at the college level, we have a similar shift in mentality perhaps starting to take place. One of the things that's really interesting is if you look at the final standings in like S&P Plus after the playoff, only one team that was in the top 15 of S&P Plus ended the season, and we're taking the playoff into account as well, with one loss, and that was Oregon, who didn't make it out of their first game in the college football playoff. Ohio State, who in past playoffs might not have even made the playoff because they lose the game to Michigan at the end, and they don't make the Big Ten title game. They won the title. Like, they were the best team in the country. They smashed Tennessee. They beat Oregon. They marched through that tournament. They beat Texas by 2 touchdowns, and then they beat Notre Dame. Like, that team might not have even had a chance in past seasons to show that they were the best team in the country by going through a playoff. This is so hard for people in college football to get their heads wrapped around, because so much of it has been the absence of loss, not the verification of victory. And we're used to it as college basketball fans, because we've seen teams that didn't have stellar regular seasons win the title, because they got hot at the right time in the tournament. We're seeing it right now in the NBA, where there's one number 1 seed left. They're being taken to a 7th game in the Western Conference. The Eastern Conference is a flawed 3 seed versus a 4 seed that's certainly not a team that played well throughout the course of the year. This is a much different mentality from how college football has always tried to decide its champions. I've always felt it was a flawed approach, but it's the approach that is essentially baked into how a lot of people think about the sport. I am all for an expanded playoff. I'm all for getting rid of conferences, conference championships as being the end-all be-all of why a team would get a bye or not a bye. I just think it's really fascinating to go through that and think about what a paradigm shift it's going to have to be for the people who are on the college football playoff committee and the people who are the pundits around college football and the coaches, because they're just so used to a completely different system.
This is maybe more just a step back theoretical and maybe a little more get off my lawny, but it does feel in sports we're getting more and more to the analytical side of sports and trying to make, can we perfect the game? Like, how can we have the best possession on offense? How can we have the best possession in basketball? Moneyball did this in baseball, but you're seeing it now with playoffs. Like, how can we make this the absolute most equitable way to create a champion? And I do wonder if that's a good or just real quick, a good or a bad thing. Cause like you mentioned the NBA, has talked for a while about, should we just do straight seeding? So get rid of the East and West and just top 16. So the best teams play each other. And like, on one hand, you can do that, but there is always a loss. There's a cost benefit. And like, part of the reason this series with the Pacers and Knicks is going to be awesome is like they're rivals. They played a bunch of times. Part of the reason the Pacers and Bucks is great is because they played a bunch of times. Like, that's what you get when you get interconference matchups. You lose that if you just go straight seeding. I do just wonder if college football is kind of going down this path of we've got to make this an absolutely perfect way to find the perfect champion. It's like, it doesn't exist. The NFL has its own flaw. Like the NBA has its own flaw. Even March Madness, which we love. It's like, that's not the best team every year that wins the title, but it's a fun process. So I worry that just in a larger sense, we're trying to like perfect everything in sports. And sometimes the imperfection is what makes it fun. In this case, I'm with you. The seeding was stupid. Yeah. This was a glaring problem.
Well, I think part of the issue is that what you said a word in there, which is equitable. And I think equitable, this is a tough word, because what does that mean in sports? Like, I'm going to quote a little bit from this Dellinger piece. The 16-team playoff proposal from the SEC and the Big Ten would award each of those two conferences twice as many automatic qualifiers as the Big 12 and the ACC. One athletic director said no one likes it. Coaches as well spoke against it, recommending to the athletic administrators on Tuesday that they, quote, push for the ACC to get 3 automatic qualifiers. So you go back and forth on this idea of, on its face, you would say, well, everything should be equal. But why, like, what is it about the ACC or the Big 12 right now that really justifies them getting as many spots as the Big 10 or the SEC? you can say, well, they're just all part of the same power conference structure, and yet they're not. I mean, there's a clear delta in terms of revenue, in terms of popularity, in terms of, what I think you would consider to be the structural integrity of some of these athletic departments, where just because you're part of one club does mean you're in a little bit of a higher financial echelon. The idea that everybody should be treated equally is not something I think that really extends well when it comes to sports, even when it comes to how we're selecting teams right now for this. Because, again, I'll go back to what I was saying. The reason all of this matters is if you play, by and large, a weaker overall conference, or if you have a selection of teams in that conference that you get to play that others don't, under the current system, it's hard to separate those things out. There are ways to kind of do it through metrics, but the metrics aren't good enough in football because the sample size is so small. It's a little easier to do in basketball. It's a lot easier to do in baseball. But in football, you either need to have more regular season games, take away the conference championship games, because those essentially kind of bring the two best teams in your conference together, which doesn't really help you understand the depth of your conference, or you need to figure out a way to add an additional game or two, or get rid of the games that don't matter against the FCS teams or against the really bad teams in Division I, in order to give yourself a better sense of what the depth of your conference is and how it all works out. So I look at the ACC model or the Big 12 model, and I say, I don't know if they necessarily at this point, from a financial perspective, should be in the same conversation. You do want to keep it somewhat equitable because you want to have buy-in, you want to avoid antitrust lawsuits, but I don't think that should automatically mean everybody gets the same, or, hey, we're going to rely on a committee that's going to be arbitrary in how they decide the rankings, which we saw this year. So that's
well, and this is the point you're saying too. This is where when people are like, "Oh, college sports is professional," it's like, well, it's not, because professional sports, theoretically, every team in the NFL is the same. They have the same salary cap, like they have the same agreement with the league. In college football, you don't. Like Big Ten teams can spend more on NIL than teams in the Mountain West, and you don't know, like, it is not equitable. And we're never going to get, the NCAA is not in a spot where in the next 2 years we're going to get where everyone's equitable, because that would mean them literally turning into a professional sport and having salary caps. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. So you're right. Like, as long as college sports is inequitable, any playoff is going to have some inequity, but you have to bake into the fact that, like, there are leaders and I'll say legends, leaders and laggards. I would say leaders and laggards in the system. And I think the trouble is that some of the small, the non-Big Ten SEC conferences, they're the ones really trying to find their place in here. I still think it's funny that Notre Dame is still able to weasel its way into this. Hey, we're going to have a spot here. Because in a way, they're kind of screwing a lot of this up, because it could be, all right, we have 5 or 6 conferences and we funnel it all into a playoff and we go from there. But you always have to have this one asterisk of like, well, but Notre Dame, ...
Yeah, there's just a lot of interesting elements in this mix. And again, a lot of it's about the hegemony of thought process in college football, this idea that the regular season should mean something. And it's like, I get that, but when you have an 18-team conference and you're only playing 9 conference games, the regular season is inherently going to mean less. And unless you're willing to say, hey, let's split these up into smaller things, let's make it actual divisional structure like the NFL, where we acknowledge the business that we're in and we acknowledge the structure. It's one of those situations where you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And while I understand what purists or fans think they want, what they're asking for is not compatible with the current structure. And I think that there's people in college athletics that understand that. But there's also a lot of people, particularly in the conferences, that are on the outside looking in right now in terms of the power structure, who don't want to acknowledge it because it's not convenient for them. And I don't blame them for not wanting to acknowledge it, but that their inability or unwillingness to acknowledge it doesn't suddenly make it not true. You mentioned like reseeding in the NBA based upon just overall record and not conference record. It is interesting to think about, because as has been brought up in light of the draft lottery that happened this week, the top 2 picks are again going to the Western Conference.
Right.
Dallas gets the number 1 pick. San Antonio gets the number 2 pick. San Antonio just recently got the number 1 pick. Like, it's fascinating how much talent historically continues to accrue in the Western Conference of the NBA. And I mean, it's not as bad as it used to be. Like, I actually think there's several East teams like the Celtics. I actually think the Pacers have a really good shot if they manage to come out of the Eastern Conference Finals against whoever they play in the West, at least of the remaining teams. But the idea overall of the East being inferior to the West, that's been around for 20 some years. And it's been very difficult for teams in the West, like, who get left out of the playoffs historically, because a 39 and 41 or 43 Eastern Conference team got in because they just happened to be the 8th best team in the 2nd best conference. That's not too dissimilar from what you're looking at here. And at least in the NBA, everybody plays everybody. Right. You don't even have that in college football. So this is where I think it's going to really get interesting as we go through this next sequence of trying to figure out what this looks like. A 16-team playoff will help a little bit, but what it is likely to do is continue to cluster more teams from the top, in those top 2 conferences. And I think ultimately, as we get through the SEC trying to get this 9-game schedule, as we get through the SEC and the Big Ten trying to do a scheduling between each other, the ACC and the Big 12 can see what's happening. They just don't really have any good way to stop it because they've made themselves too big. And in the ACC's case, as we saw with the Florida State and Clemson lawsuits, those teams feel trapped because they can't get out of the conference and go somewhere else. Right. And at this point, ESPN is the only thing keeping all of that together at this point, it feels like. And I don't know if that's going to be sustainable. And it'd be unfortunate if it continues to impact the way that the sport decides its best teams. It worked this year, but all those arguments that we heard forever about, well, all we really care about is the top 4 teams. Like, your 8th seed won the title this year. And you know who they beat? They beat the 7 seed. Like, neither of those teams would have been in, maybe one of them would have been in the top 4. But I mean, if you look at the top 4, if the committee hadn't known that it had that backstop of, hey, all these teams are getting in, your champion would have been one of Oregon, Georgia, Texas, and Penn State. And what we saw on the field showed that those were not the top 4 teams in the country, but that was how they were ranked. So that's, I think, really the key with all of this. So we'll be another quick
article. A college football article I want to bring up.
Yeah.
ESPN on their homepage, they did it's whatever, their own ranking, but again, a ranking of the best coaches going into the 2025 season in college football. Top 10, Cignetti not on it. Now, a lot of them are, it's the names you'd expect, like Kirby Smart and Dabo Sweeney, guys of good colleges, but you have historically really good. But you have, Kyle Whittingham at Utah, Matt Campbell at Iowa State, top 10, which I wouldn't call like perennial powers. And then, Cignetti's just in the very, very bottom of others receiving votes. So,
well, I'm with you there. Here's the thing. And I know some IU fans have raised the alarm over that, or
no, I'm not raising the alarm. I'm not the alarm.
The alarm.
He's behind Bill Belichick, which is
right.
I know that win a game in college first.
That is pretty dumb. But look, I'll say this in a mild bit of support of the people voting in these things. At the end of it all, you need to see Cignetti do it for 3 years before you can really say definitively that he's one of the top 10 coaches in FBS. And I don't have any problem with that. The fact that an Indiana coach is even getting an honorable mention as far as like coach, one of the top 10 coaches in the country is a sizable thing. But I don't get offended by that. And nor do I honestly get offended by people who aren't ranking Indiana in the top 25, because I understand the philosophy that, hey, maybe that was just a flash in the pan. Like, he did have all of like this perfect confluence of events where he brought a bunch of players and his staff, and the schedule ended up not being that hard. Is that really something that's sustainable? You're going to find out this year. And I think if you're an IU fan who is very optimistic about the way this season's going to go, you know what I'm talking about when I say this is just part of the process, and the process ends up being if you can demonstrate Matt Campbell at Iowa State's a great example. Matt Campbell's not on that list 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but because they've sustained for this long, he is. And I think that's the challenge for IU and Signetti. And, if you want to complain about it, you just go back and look at 2020. Would Tom Allen have been on that list at the beginning of the 2021 season? Probably. Would he have belonged there? Absolutely not.
Right.
So,
and you brought up the best point, I think, on your last pod, that look at the Vegas odds.
Yeah.
They're the ones who actually have to put money on what they're saying. And the Vegas odds have us, fourth in the conference at 8.5?
Yeah, I have 8.5 win total, but which again is kind of an interesting aspect of thinking about how schedules impact the way that you would look at a team.
Right.
I mean, it's very possible a 9-3 Indiana team next year just would have had, they had to, have to play at Oregon, at Iowa, and at Penn State. If you win one of those games and lose the other two, and you're 10-2 because you've won everything else, it's hard to say that that's not one of the top 12 or top 16 teams in the country, based upon what is likely going to be going on elsewhere. And, and the other thing I guess I'll say on it is we saw last year with the way that the AP voters vote, a lot of teams just get benefit of the doubt that they shouldn't, simply because they've done things before, which is another mentality that I think college football's got to get rid of. This idea that last season or the season before suddenly carries over into what you think of a team in a given year. That's not the way that it works. It's not the way that it works in the NFL. Right. It's not the way that it works in the NBA. And it's not the way that it works in college basketball. So why should college football be any different?
Right.
One last piece of news before we wrap up. Maryland is hiring Jim Smith as their new athletic director. And it's interesting to think about, because Maryland, of course, had this whole thing that happened where their athletic director leaves for SMU. Kevin Willard leaves and, goes to Villanova as their basketball coach. A lot of complaints and concerns about NIL money and who's got what from a resource perspective in that athletic department. And look, the whole reason Maryland's in the in the Big Ten and not the ACC now at all is because of money, because of how bad of a situation they were in. Their facilities are not great. They've poured a lot of money into football with middling results, I would say. They've gotten to some bowl games, but they have not been a regular power. So the guy that they hire, Jim Smith, is an Atlanta Braves executive. And there was an interesting note from Pete Thamel that said Maryland's pool primarily featured candidates from outside mainstream college athletics with a focus on revenue generation. And this is a guy who's been at Ohio State twice. He's been an executive with the Braves, the Falcons, and the Columbus Crew. The president of Maryland has prioritized revenue generation and modernizing the athletic department throughout the search, which sounds a lot like what Indiana went through. I mean, one of the reasons why Scott Dolson was chosen was because, he was the guy that was in charge of the varsity club. He was the money guy for IU athletics, and clearly had a vision for how to continue to modernize the athletic department. And I think a lot of schools are having to make these types of decisions if they're not already there. Like Ohio State doesn't really have to hire somebody like this because they're already there. But I think Purdue, Michigan State, who's now looking for an athletic director, Rutgers, like all of these athletic departments that have been kind of on the sidelines or have just been kind of getting dragged along by the contractual heft of the Big Ten's television deals, are suddenly like, wow, we are really in put up or shut up time. And I think some of it is like, look at what Indiana's doing. Like, no one, if you knew how the revenue structure of college athletics was supposedly working, would have looked at Indiana and said, that's a team that's going to have a top 5 contract in the country for their strength and conditioning coach. Or that's a team that's going to spend $11 million on assistant football coach salaries. Or I think they, the assistant basketball coach salaries look like they're among the highest in the nation. I saw an article on that, I think, from the Daily Hoosier earlier this week. So there's just a lot of that where it's interesting watching all of these other schools kind of go through the awakening that Indiana apparently went through a couple of years ago, where it's like, we cannot afford to continue to do things we've been doing because we are legitimately going to get left behind.
What I find interesting in that is schools like Maryland, like they're going after people who can seemingly bring the money in, but there is a chicken or an egg thing of, is it the money or is it the coaching? Because everything Dolson has done in that respect, is right, but there's a decision point there where and he hired Cignetti and did it correctly. But I mean, if he hires the wrong football coach there and doesn't have success, it's very possible Scott Dolson's out. And I mean, that's a point where you're looking at like, now you fired Allen, you now have, let's just pretend my fake middling football coach there. You have a Woodson era. It's not going well. There's a world where Dolson hasn't made it this far, and suddenly we're looking for a new athletic director, even though everything is lined up. So, you need to have the money and you need to have that infrastructure set up, but you also need to hire the correct coaches to make it work. Money's going to follow wins. And Dolson made Cignetti hire, and then all of the pieces that he had worked on now kind of flow directly into place. But I do think it's interesting, if these schools are just like, we just need to get money guys. It's like, that isn't, it is a two-headed problem. Like, you also need to make sure you're finding somebody who can effectively hire correct and good coaches, and not just bring in a bunch of money.
But it's also about retention, and a lot of it's about mentality. Yeah. And, look, I mean, Mike Locksley's been fine at Maryland as football coach, and Maryland certainly has fared better athletically, I think, over the last 4 years than they had over the years prior to that. But, it's not just everything you said. I mean, there's a will to do certain things, and you do have to hire the right people. And I think we saw that at IU with both basketball and football. Like, if you hire the wrong people, it's funny because I was trying to explain like auto racing to somebody the other day, and IndyCar in particular, and they don't watch IndyCar, and they were like, so why are certain teams good and others aren't, or why are certain drivers good? And I was like, the way I can best describe it is, if you have a bad driver and a good car, you're not going to do well. If you have a good driver and a bad car, you're not going to do well. You have to have a good driver and a good car. And even then, it's not a guarantee that you're going to do well, but it's a guarantee you won't do well if you don't have a good one in both. And that really is kind of how college athletics feels at this point, where IU clearly had the resources, and clearly they were holding back in providing those resources fully at the end of the Tom Allen era, because what you can end up doing, and this is where I think Maryland may fall, it's like, if you have an okay coach or a slightly below okay coach, and you're throwing a ton of resources at the football program, they can stay alive every year because they're winning 5 or 6 games, but it's not actually where you want to be. And that's kind of how Maryland feels right now.
It's a real inside joke. Is Maryland Dreyer Reinbold? Or
right.
Are they Myers Shank, maybe? Because they have Elio. Like, they're Myers Shank.
They're Dale Coyne. Right.
Yeah. All right. For the 6 people that enjoyed that joke, you're welcome.
No, it's or they might actually be AJ Foyt, where it's like they have just enough.
No, they don't have. I think it's Myers Shank, because I mean, you have Elio, you have a good coach. Maryland has a good coach. They couldn't keep him. Like, you have
but Myers Shank won one.
With that, yeah, you're right. So AJ, but yeah, because AJ's had, like, I mean, Faric is pretty good. They had Sato, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because, like, and again, it's actually where the IndyCar model comes in, because like Ray Hall, Letterman, they've won it
either,
but they've won 500s in the last decade. So that's where it's not. I do think you have to look. Michigan State's probably the best example of like Ray Hall, Letterman, where it's like,
right,
they can occasionally have a season where they go to the college football playoff and everything falls into place, and then everything falls apart shortly afterward.
I think they may be more like Andretti, but yeah,
highs
and lows.
All right, we've taken this metaphor too far. We really need to save this for the IndyCar podcast, which will be later on in the week. But yeah, Scott and I will be back with more coming up soon. We've got a Pacers-Knicks kind of general chatter. I won't call it a preview per se, because you're the NBA expert. I'm just the one that kind of dive bombs in every once in a while. But we'll have a podcast coming up on that. We'll have a podcast coming up on the 500 itself. That's coming up soon, plus some more IU football stuff. Scott, an unexpected pleasure to have you joining me on the show today. And hopefully we'll look forward to having you on again here relatively soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here on the show. I am Galen Clavio. He is Scott Caulfield. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Be sure to subscribe on the YouTube channel, and be sure to visit Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.